Buonasera, buonasera, good evening, signore e signori. Welcome to Home Run, the Italian-American embrace of baseball. This event is episode 4 of the series Our Voyage, Italian-American Stories that I Am Books, hello Michael, that I Am Books is presenting in partnership with NIAF, National Italian American Foundation. Together, we are continuing to foster Italian and Italian American culture. I am Chiara Durazzini, ciao a tutti, and I am the events coordinator at I Am Books. I Am Books, as you know, is an independent bookstore and cultural hub specialized in Italian and Italian American literature. We are located in the North End in Boston, so when you have a chance, please come and visit. We have this wonderful, beautiful new store. Just a reminder that this is a webinar, so you see the speakers, the three of us tonight. You don't see yourself or the other attendees. However, please feel free to write your comments or your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section below. So baseball season just opened. Yay! So at I Am Books, we thought it would be interesting to present an overview of the Italian-American baseball players. Some have been very, very famous. Some are a little less known, at least to me. So we invited Professor Larry Baldassaro and Richard Johnson. Now, let me introduce these guests. I'm going to read their bios. A native of Chicopee, Massachusetts, and a lifelong Red Sox fan, Lawrence Baldassaro is Professor Emeritus of Italian and former director of the Honors College at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's the author of Beyond the Dimaggio, Italian Americans in Baseball, Baseball Italian Style, Great Stories Told by Italian American major leaguers from Crosetti to Piazza, and Tony Lazzeri, Yankees legend and baseball pioneer. He also edited Ted Williams, A Splendid Life, co-edited with Richard A. Johnson, The American Game, Baseball and Ethnicity, and wrote the chapter on sports for the Routledge History of Italian Americans. In addition to writing about baseball, he has published essays on Italian literature, film, and politics in American and Italian journals, and served on the Executive Council of the Dante Society of America. Professor Baldassaro has been selected as a recipient of the Society for American Baseball Research Award for his biography of Tony Lazzeri. This award honors those whose outstanding research projects have significantly expanded our knowledge or understanding of baseball. Please note that all royalties from his book, Tony Lazzeri, Yankees Legend and Baseball Pioneer, are donated to the Jimmy Fund, the fundraising arm of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston and the official charity of the Boston Red Sox. And I will write in the chat all about these three books and the links to buy them at I Am Books. And now, Richard Johnson, curator of the Sports Museum of New England since 1982. He has authored, co-authored, or edited 25 books, including Histories of the Red Sox, Bruins, Celtics, Patriots, Boston Braves, Boston Garden, and Boston Marathon, and biographies of Ted Williams, Joe Dimaggio, Johnny Kelly, Harry Aganis, and Jackie Robinson. I hope I pronounced all these names well. So welcome, 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 Larry and Richard. We are talking about baseball, but I must say that I read and I loved Beyond Dimaggio, Italian Americans in Baseball. I know nothing about baseball, but this was a beautiful stories about immigrants, about ethnicity, about discrimination, not only baseball. So tell us a little bit about Italian Americans in this super American sport.
Thank you. Ciao, everyone. We'd like to start this evening by beginning with a brief overview of Italian-American involvement with Major League Baseball, focusing on the early years, and then look at some major leaguers with ties to Boston. Larry, let's get started. And first of all, let me just ask, and I think this is obvious, but why did you choose to write about Italian-Americans in baseball? I know you're very proud of your heritage and you were a great ball player in high school and college. I'm sure that all combines for your scholarship.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dick, for being here tonight. I'm honored to have you as the moderator. And Chiara, thank you for inviting us to be part of Our Journey series, Our Voyage series. And that's a particularly fitting title for this session tonight, because what I found in my research is that the journey of Italian Americans in baseball is very similar in many ways to that of Italian Americans in general. For example, if you go back to, say, the turn of the 20th century, you had a lot of discrimination and exclusion. A lot of people wouldn't sign Italians to play baseball. Gradually, basically beginning in the 1930s, more got into the game. There was gradual acceptance. And then in the second half of the 20th century, Italians rose to excel at all levels of the game, both on and off the field. So that's what we'll be looking at. Right. So as for why I write about Italians in baseball, I've been passionate about baseball for as long as I can remember. I started playing in the Pee Wee League in Chicopee when I was 10 years old. I went on to play in Sandlot Ball, high school, American Legion, 1 year of semi-pro ball in Western Mass. So I've loved the game forever. But I never wrote about baseball until 1980. And that only happened because a colleague at my university asked me to submit an article to the Journal of American Culture, which was dedicating a special issue to, believe it or not, academics writing about sports. So he talked me into it. So following the old dictum of write what you know, I wrote an essay about Ted Williams, my boyhood hero, basically trying to answer the question, was Ted Williams an appropriate role model for a kid like me? And the answer I came up with, of course, was yes, in spite of some issues that Ted had in his younger years. So that's how I got started. Actually, a few years after that, I edited a book on Ted that was published. And so that's what started me. And then I was bitten by the bug about writing about baseball. But at some point, it dawned on me, I'm the grandson of 4 Italian immigrants, grew up in an Italian household. I'm a professor of Italian interested in Italian-American history. So why not combine those interests and write about Italian-Americans in baseball, which, by the way, there was very little written about at that time. So this all started around 1990, and that's been my focus ever since. And the result is the 3 books that Chiara mentioned, as well as numerous articles in journals and sports encyclopedias. And my goal in all of this is to help preserve this long and illustrious legacy of Italian contributions to baseball.
What do we know about the earliest Italian Americans to play? Because you spoke of the prejudice and the hurdles that had to be cleared early on. And who are some of the early heroes?
Well, the first player of Italian descent that we know for sure was Ed Abatikio. Ed Abatikio.
Should I start sharing?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let me go and share.
Mr. Abatikio was a native of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He was the son of Italian immigrants. And He started playing Major League Baseball right at the very end of the 1897 season with the Philadelphia Phillies. Played in 3 games at the end of the season. And then he played a few more games in early 1898 with the Phillies. And then he spent a few years in the minor leagues. He came back to the majors in 1903. We have the photo of Ed Abatikio in his Boston
Yes,
uniform.
just a second.
Okay. So he signed, there he is, 1903 with the Boston Bean Eaters, as they were known at that time. They weren't the Braves at that time, the Boston Bean Eaters. He was with them from 1903 to 1905. And in those 3 years, he played in virtually every game at second and short. He was an infielder. He was out of the game in 1906, signed with the Pirates in 1907, and was with them through 1909. And then he finished his career briefly in 1910, now playing with the Boston Doves. They changed their name again. So he had a 9-year career. It wasn't a distinguished career, it was solid, but he hit .254 lifetime with 11 homers in 9 seasons. But look, nobody hit many home runs then, especially middle infielders until we get to Tony Lazzeri. His best season came in 1907 when he came in second in the National League in runs batted in, tied with his double play partner, who was the legendary Honus Wagner.
Wow.
Who, by the way, thought a lot about Abatikio as a person and as a baseball player. Now, even though he was the first Italian-American in the major leagues, and the media knew that, they acknowledged it, but they didn't pay much attention to his ethnicity, except in 1903, one Boston writer raised this question: does the entrance of an Italian into baseball presage another great ethnological movement such as taken place in the American labor world? Then he noted that while a decade earlier, the large majority of laborers seen in the city streets were Irish, but now the majority are Italians. He poses another question: will the Italians supplant the Irish on the diamond as they have supplanted them with the pick and the shovel? Kind of an interesting question, which raises the issue of why would he be so concerned about this influx of Italians, first in the city and then he's perhaps in baseball. Well, that writer needn't have worried about it. Abatikio was not the start of a new wave of Italians in baseball. He was, in fact, an aberration. Very few people got into baseball. And by 1926, only 15 Italian Americans had ever played in Major League Baseball. And most of them had very brief careers.
Yes.
They faced a lot of prejudice. They were routinely called Dagos and Wops by fans and opposing players. And those were terms in those days even appeared routinely in the New York Times. It was part of the jargon of the time, but it clearly was a way of portraying these new ball players, this new ethnic group in baseball, as something that's not quite fully accepted yet as Americans.
So that sort of brings up the question of then who was the first Italian American to sort of break through as a star, as a headline grabber, and I'm guessing we know who this is because you've written the definitive biography.
Yes, this is that honor goes to a 22-year-old rookie from San Francisco, a second baseman, who broke into the starting lineup of the New York Yankees in 1926 alongside Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. And he was with the Yankees from 1926 to 1937. I knew very little about Lazzeri until I started doing research on Beyond Dimaggio. I knew he was a Hall of Famer, but what I discovered and what shocked me was that Tony was one of the most celebrated athletes in America in the 20s and 30s. He was praised by both the press and his peers, even opposing players, not only as one of the best players of his era, but one of the smartest and most respected. And he was tremendously popular with the fans. He was quiet, modest, and there was something about him that appealed to the fans. And of all those Yankees in that great Murderers Row lineup, only Babe Ruth was more popular with the fans than Tony. Now, you see the subtitle of the book, Yankees Legend and Baseball Pioneer. What made him a legend? Well, in his rookie year, he had 18 home runs. Not that many, you would say, but in 1926, that was good enough for third place in the American League.
Yes.
Babe Ruth hit 47. He was in a world of his own. Al Simmons from Milwaukee hit 19, and Tony, 18, number 3. He was second in the league with 117 RBIs, only to Babe Ruth. So he got off to a great start, and he continued. He continued to be a key player for the Yankees teams that won 5 World Series in his 12 years. And the other startling thing I learned about him, even as a 22-year-old rookie, he was the de facto captain. He was the on-field leader of those great Murderers Row teams. When the team got into trouble, he was the guy that even the veterans looked to, not Ruth or not Gary. That to me was a tremendous surprise and tells us a lot about his character. Pioneer. Tony was the first professional ball player in organized baseball to hit 60 home runs in one season. He did that in 1925, his final season in the minors, playing in the Pacific Coast League for the Salt Lake City Bees. When he got to the majors, he became one of the first middle infielders to hit with power. At that time, only the legendary Rogers Hornsby hit with the kind of power that Tony would, home runs and RBIs. But most important for what we're talking about tonight is that Tony Lazzeri was the first major star of Italian descent in the big leagues, 10 years before Joe Dimaggio came on the scene. The biggest surprise for me is what an incredible social impact this man had. Now, he starts this 1926. Put it in historical context. 2 years before that, Congress passed this very restrictive immigration act that basically kept immigrants out of America from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the majority of those were Italian. So that gives you a sense of the prejudice, the discrimination that still existed. And Lazzeri comes along in 1926 and becomes this tremendously popular player for one of the greatest teams in baseball history. So he instilled pride in Italian immigrants at a time of, again, widespread prejudice. And, you know, the great majority of Italian immigrants at that time were at best indifferent to baseball. They thought it was a childish game, a waste of time. They didn't want their kids to play baseball. You can't make a living, et cetera, et cetera. But suddenly, with the appearance of Tony Lazzeri, they had a hero. Here's one of their own who's being cheered and admired by countless Americans in the undisputed national pastime. And he became their hero. They celebrated him tremendously. In 1927, they had 3 banquets for him in New York, Detroit, and Boston. Banquets that drew hundreds of people to celebrate this new hero. Now, given Tony's modesty, his innate leadership ability, his work ethic, he did so much to counter all those negative stereotypes about Italians that have been ingrained in the American consciousness since the 1880s. So I make the argument in the book that no one before him did as much as Tony Lazzeri to enhance the public perception of Italians in this country. So one more thing, he managed to achieve all that he did while dealing with the daily challenge of living with epilepsy. Another shocking surprise, because at that time, epilepsy was such a stigmatized affliction that you kept quiet about it. The fans never knew that he was an epileptic. So for all these reasons, I felt like I had discovered this buried treasure of baseball history. And so I made this effort to restore him to his rightful place in baseball.
I think you did a brilliant job, because this is a gentleman who was a social and cultural icon as well as a sporting hero. And the fact he won one more World Series than Babe Ruth did in the pinstripes. And imagine a Yankee being celebrated with a banquet in Boston. Just that achievement alone would put you on the map. But of course, it's interesting. He paved the way for another Bay Area star to come to New York, and Joe Dimaggio, and of course Crosetti and others who played for the team. Can you discuss a bit about the transition from the Murderers Row, Tony Lazzeri era of the Yankees to the ascendancy of the great Joe Dimaggio?
Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time. Here's a picture of Joe in the Fenway dugout, in fact, probably in his rookie year of 1936, with Frank Crosetti to his right, who was Tony Lazzeri's double play partner, and of course Lazzeri to his left. So I'm not going to say too much about Joe, because I think pretty much everybody knows a fair amount about Joe Dimaggio. I mean, I think it's fair to say he was the greatest hero that Italian Americans have ever had. He transcended baseball to become an iconic figure in 20th century America. He was the leader of these Yankees teams that won 10 World Series in his 13 years. But what set Joe apart was his smooth elegance on the field. Here's what Ted Williams said about Joe. Joe was simply the greatest player I ever saw, as well as the most graceful. In other words, Dimaggio had what Italians call sprezzatura, which is the art of making the difficult look easy. He was the Yankee Clipper gliding across the vast center field of Yankee Stadium. Let me just read this brief segment from Beyond Dimaggio. Joe Dimaggio may not have been my childhood hero. As a Red Sox fan, I favored Ted Williams, but I've come to understand why he meant so much to my parents' generation. For those who lived through the Depression and World War II, this son of immigrants who excelled at the quintessential American game became a symbol of their own hopes of finding a place in a new land that was not always welcoming. And no one before or since gave them a greater sense of pride. New York Daily News columnist Mike Lupica recognized what Dimaggio meant to his father and grandfather. Quote, there was only one ball player for them, an Italian American of such talent and fierce pride, it made them fiercely proud, fiercely biased toward their man, even after he had left the playing field for good. And perhaps Tommy Lasorda summed it up best when he said, he was our hero. He was what we all wanted to be.
It's very well stated. Now, when did Italian Americans reach their pinnacle of success in baseball? I'm guessing it's in the post-war period, Larry.
Exactly, Dick. In the years immediately following World War II, New York City became the capital of the baseball world. And in between 1947 and 1958, New York teams appeared in all but one World Series. Now we know that in 46, the Red Sox won the pennant, but the only year from 47 to 58 that a Yankees or Dodgers or Giants team wasn't in the World Series was, of course, 48, when the Braves got to the series but lost to the Indians. So the Yankees dominated, 10 pennants and 8 World Series in those years. Dodgers, 6 pennants and 1 World Series, and the Giants, 2 pennants and 1 World Series. But the key here, it was in that period when Italians achieved unprecedented visibility and prominence because so many of them played on those 3 Yankees teams. The Yankees had Joe Dimaggio, Yogi Berra, Phil Rizzuto, Billy Martin, who was half Italian but really all Italian, and their best pitcher was Vic Raschi, a native of Springfield, known as the Springfield Rifle. The Dodgers had Carl Furillo, the great right fielder with the best arm in baseball, Roy Campanella, three-time MVP catcher, and their young star pitcher was Ralph Branca. And the Giants had two great pitchers, Sal Magli and Johnny Antonelli. In those years, between 47 and 58, 8 of the 22 MVP awards were won by Italian Americans playing for those three New York teams. Berra and Campanella each won 3 times. Joe Dimaggio in 47, and he had already won 2 before the war, and Phil Rizzuto in 1950. And 5 other times, Italian Americans finished second in the MVP award. Now, all those Italian Americans in New York, don't forget, though, that the Red Sox had 2 major stars of their own. Dom Dimaggio, a 7-time All-Star, and third baseman Frank Malzone, a 6-time All-Star.
Yeah. Can you summarize a bit of what happened next after this great generation? It was sort of interesting because those players sort of paralleled the ascendancy of the great Italian American boxers from that time period. They
Yes.
almost flowed in the same, in the same progression. What happened next?
Well, in the economic boom, say, of the 50s and the decades following, there were more opportunities for higher education, other avenues open for economic and social advancement. So you had fewer players of Italian descent playing Major League Baseball. Also because of, mixed marriages were becoming more common and more people were moving away from home. I sensed among those players, especially from the 70s and on, who had perhaps a diminished sense of their ethnic identity. They were proud of their Italian heritage, and some of them regretted that they hadn't learned Italian when they were young, but they tended to identify themselves more as American. But at the same time, in those later years, Italians are experiencing upward mobility. They were moving into management positions as on-field managers, front office executives, owners, and of course, the first owner of Italian descent in the major leagues was a Massachusetts native named Lou Perini, who was the principal owner of the Braves from 1945 to 1962. So fewer players of Italian descent in the second half of the century, but there were still many great players. And of the 10 Hall of Famers of Italian descent, 10 players in the Hall of Fame, 4 of them began their careers in the 1960s or later. Ron Santo, John Smoltz, Craig Biggio, and Mike Piazza. There are 3 managers in the Hall of Fame, Lasorda, La Russa, and Torre, and all 3 of them began their careers in the 50s and 60s.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's really it's the ladder that led from, generations going to college, getting executive jobs, and then owning companies. It's the same sort of, it's the template of becoming Americans. Yeah. Now, we're going to discuss, I think, here some of the Italian Americans with the connections to New England and to Massachusetts. And I know that we were very proud here to basically have had players such as the great Dom Dimaggio, who was a gentleman who I had the privilege to know briefly, but of course was the elegant presence in center field, was proclaimed by journalists and fans alike as the best center fielder we'd had since the great Tris Speaker, and bore the burden very gracefully of being the brother of the great Joe Dimaggio, where the comparisons were inevitable. Of course, it did lead to a song written about him, which had the memorable stanza, "Who's better than his brother Joe? Dominic Dimaggio." Well, I'm sure that there could be some argument on that, but certainly that they were both, along with their brother Vince Dimaggio, who played for the Boston Braves, of course, as the great Casey Stengel once said, well, Joe was probably the best player. Don may have been the best fielder, but Vince was the best singer, which faint praise indeed, I guess. And then, of course, we think of the great Rico Petrocelli. He was one of my heroes growing up. I mean, a slugging shortstop. We probably had not had a better slugging shortstop since the great Vern Stevens. And until A-Rod broke his home run record for shortstops, Rico had the record with 40 home runs for shortstops by an American leaguer. And I remember one of the great days he had, certainly as a member of the Impossible Dream Sox, of course, he'll always be remembered. But on the great Memorial Day Friday game with Sonny Siebert versus Vida Blue, Rico hit 2 home runs off Vida Blue to win that game for the Red Sox in probably one of the 3 or 4 most memorable regular season games for the Red Sox ever. It's right up there with the Walter Johnson, Smokey Joe Wood game of 1912.
Dick, excuse me.
Yes.
Can we just jump back to Dominic for a minute?
Oh, please, yes.
Can we go back to Dom's photo, please? Okay. Now, Dominic Dimaggio, the little professor, I have to say that of the more than 50 major leaguers of Italian descent that I've interviewed and met, none was more intelligent, more cordial, and more articulate than Dom Dimaggio. I'd never met Dom. When I found out he was coming to the All-Star game here in Milwaukee in 2002, I reached out to him. We'd never met. And not only did he agree to meet me when he came here, he says, well, why don't we have dinner the night before the game, which we did. And I guess that conversation went well enough that at the end of dinner, he said, well, why don't you meet me for breakfast at the hotel tomorrow morning, which I did. And he graciously answered all my questions. He was terrific. And while we're having breakfast, he said, look, I've got an extra ticket for the All-Star game tonight. Would you like to sit with me in the VIP section of Miller Park? Well, I had a press pass for the game, but I wasn't about to give up the chance to watch an All-Star game with a man who was not only a 7-time All-Star, but one of my very earliest Red Sox heroes. So there we sat, and it was a tremendous experience for me. Now, you mentioned comparison with his brother Joe. I was surprised at how candid Dominic was in talking about that comparison, especially with somebody he'd never met before. Here's what he said. Sure, there was a friendly competition with my brother Joe. I had a great desire to beat the Yankees, and Joe was part of them. So I guess in that respect, you might say I was competing against him. But I knew there was a big difference. Joe was much bigger than I was, and he hit the ball harder than I did. Did I get less recognition than Joe? Well, not only Joe, but also because of Ted Williams. I've got Ted on one side of me in the outfield, and Joe's my brother. I was privileged to be Joe's brother and a teammate of Teddy my entire career, and I love both of those guys. But I don't think there's a doubt that people have now been saying for some years that I have been grossly underrated. Now, I didn't detect any sense of arrogance or bitterness in what he said. I was surprised. I think he just wanted to get it off his chest, probably stuff he's been keeping in for a long time. I asked Dominic if he was proud to be Italian. Absolutely, he said, I certainly am. I didn't encounter any prejudice when I was playing. There were all kinds of ethnic differences, and we all needled each other. In our own clubhouse, we would use all kinds of names and pay no attention to it. It was all in fun. However, in spite of his fame as a ball player and his financial success as a businessman after he retired, he did encounter some prejudice after he retired from baseball. He said, when I applied for membership in a country club in Massachusetts, I was blackballed by 2 members. I was a jock, an Italian, and Catholic. The club was embarrassed, so they asked me to reapply, and I was let in. Yogi Berra told me a very similar story. He said that in the early 50s, he said they wouldn't let me into a country club in New Jersey. They didn't like Italians then. So I went to an Italian club. I got in there real quick. So there was still that lingering prejudice even in the 50s.
Well, he should have been owner of the Red Sox too. He made a bid for the team in 1976 after Tom Yawkey had died. I think it ended up being a $16 million transaction. That wouldn't buy you one hot dog stand in the ballpark now. He should have been team owner, and I never forget that when they had the celebration for Ted Williams in 2002, Dom was there as one of the teammates speaking on behalf of the players who played with Ted. And I could only think, as I saw him there in his suit, elegantly dressed, beautifully comported, this should be the guy who owns the whole operation, because he was such a good businessman. He's a part owner of the Boston Patriots and was an incredibly successful gentleman off the field.
For sure.
And that should have happened, but there we go, you know. But so other players, again, I had spoken of Rico, and you got a chance to speak with him too, didn't you?
Yeah, I met him at the Ted Williams Museum in Hernando, Florida in 2003. We had a few things in common. He's literally 2 days older than I am. Both of our fathers worked for the railroad, and his family, like my mother's family, were from the Abruzzo region of Italy. So he talked about going to ball games with his brothers. He was the youngest of 7 children. He says, one day my brothers took me to Yankee Stadium. We're out in the bleachers. Joe Dimaggio was still playing. He said, I'll never forget this. I looked around, and here the pitcher was throwing the ball, but everyone in the bleachers was looking at Joe Dimaggio. No one was even looking at the ball or the hitter. He was such a hero. And then he'd go catch a ball, he'd just lope after it. It was just beautiful to watch. My father, the only thing he knew about baseball was Joe Dimaggio and Yogi Berra and Phil Rizzuto, because he could relate to them. And then he told me about his connection with other players and with the community in Boston. I felt a bond with other Italian players. Tony Conigliaro was a close friend of mine. We knew about the heritage of Italian Americans who had struggled in other fields. They were proud of us, and we wanted to acknowledge that. The Italians in the North End and the Sons of Italy, they were fantastic. I just loved to go to the North End. They were all Italians from the old country. I'd go in and have a beer with a friend of mine from the area, and geez, the whole place would come over. Hey, how are you doing? They made me feel really good. So.
I love the fact that in your book, you also extended your scope to include umpire Steve Palermo, a fellow native of Worcester, my hometown. Right. Talk a little bit about Steve Palermo.
I interviewed Steve in December 2016, and he spoke at length about how he became an umpire and about the nature of the job. He said there's nothing easy about being an umpire, pointing out that you have to be a psychologist, a lawyer, a judge, and a law enforcement officer. He said there were few players and managers that were difficult to deal with. I was in that era with Billy Martin, Earl Weaver, Ralph Houk, and Dick Williams. These were rough, tough, old baseball guys, and they'd come out and challenge you. Then he gave me another example of why it wasn't easy to be an umpire. Steve was the third base umpire in the 1976 playoff game at Fenway against the Yankees. As the third base umpire, he's the guy that got to call Bucky Dent's game-winning home run fair. Well, his father and mother, both Red Sox fans, were at the game, and Palermo then described the scene following the game as the three of them were driving to his parents' home near Worcester. There was no conversation in the car. I turned to my dad and said, Pop, that was a hell of a game, wasn't it? And he turned to me and he just looked at me and said, you couldn't have called that ball foul. I said, what ball? Bucky's home run. He said, Pop, the ball was 10 feet to the right of the foul pole. So what? He said, you were in Boston, nobody would have said a word. And then he told me, you know, when people ask me about pressure, you have no idea what pressure was. But the most moving part came at the end of the interview. He spoke about his response to his life-changing misfortune when he was paralyzed by a gunshot when he and someone else ran out of a restaurant to try to save two women who were being assaulted. And he ended up being shot and basically paralyzed for several years. He said, we all have a story to tell. My injury is part of the story. Unfortunately, I very much enjoyed being an umpire. It was a great challenge to try to be perfect every night. The thing I regret is that I didn't leave on my own terms. I was forced off. I haven't officially retired yet. And if they come up with some miraculous cure come spring training, you'll see me out on the ball field. You learn along the way that you're as vulnerable as anyone else. This thing that we call life is very, very fragile. I know that the colors in my world are a little bit more vivid than most people's colors. The reds are redder, the greens are greener. It's been a humbling experience in a lot of ways, but we'll keep fighting the good fight. You can either throw your hands up and say, I give up, or you can pound your fist on the table and say, I'm going to fight this thing to the end. That was the end of our conversation. 6 months later, those words became even more poignant when I learned that he had died at 67 from complications of lung cancer. Not once in our conversation did he say anything about his illness, nor express any self-pity. All he wanted to do was get back on the field and return to the job he loved. So for me, as much as anyone I've met in Major League Baseball, Steve Palermo represents the best in baseball, both on and off the field.
His memory is a blessing, as is that of the great Abe Bartlett Giamatti, another native of Western Massachusetts, who really was a poet laureate of the game as well as a leader. Talk a bit about the former Yale and National League president who became commissioner.
Yeah. Well, I followed Bart Giamatti's career very closely. My town of Chicopee was just a few miles from South Hadley, where he grew up because his father was a professor of Italian at Mount Holyoke College. And we both were teachers of medieval and Renaissance literature. We both shared a love of baseball, and we were both Red Sox fans. So for this closing segment, I just want to read a part of what I wrote about Giamatti, because it does tie into our theme of the voyage. Since Giamatti was commissioner for only 6 months, it's impossible to know how his tenure would have gone. However, his love of the game demonstrated both in his defense of its traditions and his eloquent celebration of its meaning were enough to convince many of his unique status in the game. New York Times columnist Ira Berkow speculated that Giamatti, quote, this most cultured and civilized and warm and generous and witty man might have become the best baseball commissioner we've ever had. He had brains, sinew, and the best wishes of the game, unquote. To my mind, no one better epitomizes the culmination of the evolution of Italian Americans in baseball or in American society for that matter. Giamatti understood the nature and significance of the immigrant experience, and he wrote about it as eloquently as he did about baseball. The significance of his impact on the game is not just that he rose to its highest office, but that he was also one of its most passionate and eloquent exponents. Giamatti was a purist when it came to baseball. When he was named president of the National League, he told the press, I favor the fundamental grid, the geometric beauty, the fundamental structure of the history of baseball, and I think it ought to be tempered with very, very gingerly. And this final part brings us back to the notion of the journey. For Giamatti, the ultimate fan who saw in the game he loved a clear expression of the national psyche, baseball became a metaphorical expression of the American dream, not as material fulfillment, but as a spiritual quest for home. He wrote, "What is baseball and indeed much of the American experience about but looking for home? The basic rhythm of baseball, the going out and the subsequent quest to return home, is part of the plot of the story of our national life. It is a story of going home after having left home. The concept of home has a particular resonance for a nation of immigrants, all of whom left one home to seek another. Baseball is no game, but a work of art, fashioned to remind us that we all began in the great green Allegiant field of the New World with all its terrors and promises."
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I've often thought, and again, I often will describe the distance between the bases as something that could have been designed by Da Vinci. Someone could do a very, very good chart showing it as though it had been drawn by him, because is there a more perfect dimensional template in sports than a baseball diamond? I don't think so. But we're going to talk a little at the end here, since we're on the eve of opening day, and opening day has such a resonance in Boston. And of course, the Italian-American connection to that is the great Tony Conigliaro, who I was going to talk about a little bit in terms of, you know, his importance here, because to me, he was my childhood hero. And of course, he was that rarest of Boston sports creatures who was a homegrown star. We don't have many of them here, and he certainly was. So I was going to talk a little bit about him, if I may. I wasn't sure if you wanted to talk about him before I say a few things, Larry.
No, this is yours, dude.
Okay, very good. Well, I've written, F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, "Show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy." And such was the case with the Tony Conigliaro. For 7 precious seasons, our own Tony C. was Boston's prince of the city. Less than a year after graduating from St. Mary's High in Lynn, he played his first big league game at Yankee Stadium, where he stroked his first hit off Hall of Famer Whitey Ford, made a superb running catch at the 407-foot sign in right center field, and later was written up in wire service stories for accusing Ford of throwing spitballs in the 4-3 Red Sox win. Soon after, in a game characterized by echoes of other Boston tragedies, Conigliaro hit a home run in his first ever Fenway Park at bat on opening day against Joel Horlin of the White Sox, on a day where his feat was cheered by Robert F. Kennedy and nearly the entire Kennedy clan. On a day, the Red Sox donated the entire gate proceeds to the fledgling John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. By late June of that year, he'd hit 20 home runs and was batting .280 when a Pedro Ramos fastball broke his arm and sidelined him until September. There's no doubt he'd have challenged and possibly even broken Wally Berger's rookie home run mark of 38 had he remained healthy. As it was, he became the youngest player to ever lead the league in that category. And over a half century later, he remains the youngest American League batter to reach the 100 home run plateau. After slumping to 28 home runs in 1966, the 1967 season promised to be his best ever, as by mid-August, he'd already hit 20 home runs for a team in the midst of an epic pennant race. However, on August 18th, his world came crashing down as he was beamed in the left eye by a Jack Hamilton fastball. What followed was a full season on the disabled list and a gallant comeback that saw the prodigy return in style again on opening day, 1969. On the same day, brother Billy made his major league debut for the Red Sox. On a sunny afternoon in Baltimore, in yet another dramatic entrance, Tony socked a 10th inning, 2-run homer to put the Red Sox ahead of the Orioles in a game they won by a score of 5-4 in 12 innings. And of course, Tony scored the winning run. Broadcaster Ken Coleman was rendered nearly speechless while simply remarking, storybook stuff. His comeback continued that season with 19 additional homers, and in 1970, he enjoyed his best season ever, hitting literally with the sight of one eye, achieving career single-season marks of 36 home runs, 149 hits, and 116 RBIs. Traded in October 1970, he only played a half season with the Angels before retiring. An abortive 21-game comeback with the Red Sox in 1975 saw him beat out rookie Jim Rice for the role of designated hitter and stroke a base hit in his return to Fenway Park on a memorable opening day when he shared the spotlight with the great Henry Aaron, who was making his debut for the Milwaukee Brewers. It was also a day in which he received 3 sustained, memorable standing ovations. Had he not suffered that tragic eye injury, I have no doubt, and Larry, I'm sure, agrees with me wholeheartedly, he'd have enjoyed a Hall of Fame career. And we remember him on this eve of opening day because those were the 3 best opening days in my many years as a Red Sox fan.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you so much. So let's see just a second if we have a couple of questions. Well, Jerry is looking forward to hear about the first prominent Italian-American proof ball player at Abatikio, and we spoke a little bit about that. And then there's a question, if you want, about Joe Dimaggio. Alfonso is asking, in your opinion, what was Joe Dimaggio's legacy as an Italian-American in baseball, and what was his impact in the Italian-American community? I don't know if you want to, I don't know, comment on both of these players or...
Well, I didn't say anything about Ed Abatikio as a football player because, you know, we have a limited time, but before he became a Major League baseball player, he may have been the first, well, he certainly was the first Italian-American professional football player, because in his hometown of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, there was a football team that's generally recognized as the first professional football team in America. And Ed Abatikio was a star fullback and kicker. So he played a few years professional football. In fact, he once played against Christy Mathewson, who was also a professional football player for a while. So that's the other side. So Abatikio was a tremendous athlete, obviously, to accomplish both of those feats. As far as Joe Dimaggio, I mean, and Dick jump in here too, but I mean, as I said, he clearly is the greatest Italian-American hero we've had. He inspired all that pride, and, you know, the quotation from Mike Lupica about the effect it had on his father and grandfather and the sense of pride. Joe was not particularly outspoken about bias in the against the Italian-American community, but he clearly instilled this great sense of pride. And, you know, he was, again, a cultural icon. He totally transcended baseball even before he married Marilyn Monroe. I mean, and he has, let's face it, he has what many sports historians consider the single greatest record in any sport, the 56-game hitting streak in 1941. So, I mean, I don't know, what more is there to say about Joe? Dick, you want to add something?
Well, I remember my dad saw him play at Yankee Stadium several times when he was training as a doctor in New York in the late 1930s. And I remember him saying, seeing Joe Dimaggio play at Yankee Stadium was like listening or watching Heifetz play the violin at Carnegie Hall. He said it was unmistakably beautiful. There was a grace and an artfulness to the way he moved. There was an economy of style, but it was unmistakable. He was one of those players who sports cartoonists could capture him in 2 or 3 lines, and that they would be beautiful, sweeping lines, because he, as you said, he made it look easy. And there was just a great beauty about him. So, you know, there's a short list of athletes who sort of push their craft into the realm of art. I would imagine probably Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Bobby Orr, certainly. Joe D might be at the head of that list because he was just beautiful to watch. And I even love going on to YouTube and watching footage of him playing, because you sort of look and you go, wow, he made it look like anybody could do that. And in the expanse of the old Yankee Stadium, where it was so big, they had the monuments on the field, the flagpole was on the field. He owned that real estate. No one ever patrolled it better.
Wow, that's
Yankee
fabulous.
Clipper.
We have a bunch of questions. I hope you will have time to reply to all. Christopher is asking, I know Ralph Branca befriended Jackie Robinson to help him through the transition into MLB. Were there other Italian Americans that demonstrated similar gestures to assist African Americans in the early days of their experience in playing in MLB? Which I guess it's Major League Baseball, I guess.
Very good credit.
Yay!
Yeah. I no example pops into my head, but that doesn't mean anything because at my age, the memory is not what it used to be. I don't know, Dick, if you have.
Well, you know, what's interesting about Branca is not only, you know, had he experienced the prejudices certainly that both he had experienced and his parents, and I'm sure relatives had as Italian Americans in this country, but he was also Jewish. So that there was this wonderful layer of social consciousness that surrounded him, and his embracing of Jackie, which has been memorialized in the movie 42.
Yeah.
And, you know, and certainly then several years after, the realm of, you know, suffering that he experienced after the Bobby Thompson home run and the fact that they actually became friends. There's a great humanity about Branca, and the Robinson connection really brings that out. So I think that was a wonderful question, and certainly is one of the great hallmarks of one generation of, you know, of Americans assimilating, reaching out and having a sympathy with, you know, very similar challenges that were being thrown at a fellow teammate.
Right. Yeah. Now, Michael is asking, do you feel that Rizzo and Gallo of the Yankees can be part of the next generation of Italian American superstar players? Rizzo and Gallo. I pronounced it very Italianish. I don't know if it's understandable.
Well, you know, you're talking to a Red Sox fan here, so
Yeah.
the heat praise on a Yankee is kind of, no, I kid about that because frankly, in doing the research for Beyond Dimaggio, I hated every Yankee, including Berra, Rizzuto, Dimaggio, because they were the enemy. But as I got older and as doing research, I came to respect and understand their greatness. Joey Gallo, I mean, he's kind of a typical slugger, like home run or bust. I mean, I think he's got great potential. I'm not sure you could compare him with any of the greats at this point, but yeah, he can certainly hit the ball a long way.
I'm also guessing that they could both go to the North End after a game and they would maybe not have to buy a beer or a pastry, a modern pastry. I think they'd be treated very well.
Right. That's a good point. John is asking, did any of these players go back to Italia and perform in exhibition games? Perhaps. Yes?
Well, I'm not aware that any played in Italy, but many have gone to Italy as ambassadors. Well, Mike Piazza, a great player, Hall of Famer, he's the manager of the Italian baseball team that, you know, in international competitions. I was with Mike in the original World Baseball Classic. I was playing the role of the interpreter because you had both Italians and Italian Americans. And Mike was wonderful. He's as to me, of all the younger players, has a greater sense of his ethnic identity and history and his place in Italian American baseball. And so he, was a clear example of someone who has become very much involved in baseball in Italy. To the extent of owning a team in Italy.
He also bought a lower division soccer team too. So his embracing of his Italian American sporting heritage is unusual.
Yes.
Wow. All right. Chris is asking, how has John Franco impacted the contributions of Italian Americans in baseball? John Franco.
I couldn't give you statistics about John unless they were in front of me, but clearly he's an outstanding pitcher, one of the best there's ever been in that role as a reliever. So yeah, he stands up there, as one of the top Italian American baseball players of certainly the post-war era, an outstanding player. And he also was one of the coaches for the Italian team in the World Baseball Classic. So he's maintained that role as well.
Well, and it gave the Mets a chance to match the Yankees a little bit in having some Italian American flavor to their greatness too.
Right.
Nice. Now, Steve, last question. Steve asks, do you think it is a coincidence that so many Italians played catcher? Campanella, Berra, Garagiola, Girardi, Torre, Scioscia, and Piazza, and many more. Also managers, for that matter.
Great question.
Well, you could make an argument that, catchers are the most intelligent people in baseball because they have to keep so many things going at the same time. And of course, if they become managers, that reinforces that positive stereotype. I'm not sure how far you can take that generalization because there have been great players at every position, pitching. Joe Dimaggio is an outfielder, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I think catching is a position that requires maybe a little more intellectual engagement than most other positions, because they're calling the pitches, not the pitcher.
Well, and it would also be the position where it would not be the first choice of most young players to get behind and really suffer the slings and arrows of taking foul tips and getting your hand broken and all of that. And so there's a workmanlike quality to that too. And, there's a great honor in being a catcher. Again, you're sort of helping control the game too, but you're also enduring the most pain. You're suffering the most. So it's interesting that if you look at the similar journey of other ethnic groups in baseball, a lot of the early Irish stars were catchers. King Kelly, for example, going way back. So it was an entry point too. But it also, again, as part of that journey, it was an entry point that has been pointed out here, would often lead to the manager's seat. So I think it's a great distinction. The tools of ignorance that is a misnomer.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I think it's time to wrap it up, but I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope our attendees did too. Thank you so much, Larry, and thank you, Richard. You are super experts in this subject, and really, it's very much appreciated. So until next time, I hope we will have another opportunity, perhaps in person, to have you guys at IM Books. In the meantime, please, all attendees, keep an eye on our upcoming events. We have a lot of online and in-person events coming up this spring. So please go to our website and check them out, or subscribe to our newsletter. Buonanotte, grazie a tutti. Thank you so much again and see you soon. Arrivederci. Grazie Richard, grazie
Thank
Larry.
you.
Arrivederci.
Ciao.
Grazie a te.
Uh,